Keith Brown, we have politicians here in the studio. I'll keep you there just so you can respond and listen to what they have to say. A majority of seats would constitute a trigger for mandate negotiations with the UK government, whoever that is at the time. Do you accept that support is still, broadly speaking, 50-50 for independence? So despite the problems that the SNP have had with a police investigation into their finances, Nicola Sturgeon has stepped down, who'd been seen as the best leader in UK politics for some time, and a loss of the by-election, and still 50% of people in Scotland would like to see independence.
I'm afraid that what we've heard there is a strategy of desperation, with the goalposts moving so loudly you can almost hear it in the background. So the SNP were saying that they wanted to get a majority of the votes. They've now shifted that to 29 seats. I simply do not see, in all credibility, how you can say that if they move from having won 48 seats, and of course having lost Rutherglen, having had a defection to the Conservatives just a few days ago, against that backdrop of absolute chaos and with their fortunes disintegrating, to say that winning 29 seats would constitute a new mandate.
But still 50-50 support for independence
is simply not true. We had a referendum in 2014 on this question. I think most people in Scotland would be horrified at the prospect of reopening this toxic question just a decade after we had what was meant to be a once-in-a-generation event. And there is simply no way on earth that a Conservative government would regard the SNP losing a load of seats as a mandate for them to get another referendum.
No way on earth for you, Alex, too, and the Labour Party, and a Labour government if you win?
We're seeing, yet again, the SNP moving the goalposts, as Simon said, in terms of how they determine the constitutional future of Scotland and the United Kingdom, whereas I'd like to see them put that effort into actually helping the people of Scotland face some of the massive challenges that people are facing in terms of a cost of living crisis, NHS waiting times in Scotland, you know, in crisis, looking at how we can actually help people on the ground, rather than obsessing over the constitutional future, which has been already debated, has been discussed. I mean, the only real change for the people of Scotland is electing a Labour government, as we saw with them choosing to vote for us in Rutherglen and Hamilton recently.
Right. I mean, Keith, losing a bunch of seats won't constitute a mandate for negotiations. What do you say in response to both Simon and Alex? And I'll come to you.
Well, first of all, just as I've said, it's ludicrous. When I see them apply that to any Labour or Tory government that still retains a majority of seats, but less than before, disallowing them to carry out their manifesto, then I believe it. But the irony of the Labour and Tory parties saying we are moving the goalposts, when they agreed under the Smith Commission, they signed under the Smith Commission, nothing should prevent the people of Scotland moving towards independence if that's what they choose. They're the ones that are changing the goalposts. And of course, the goalposts are the ones set for success, the barometer of success at Westminster. They are, if you win a majority of seats, you have the right to have that mandate. But to hear from the Labour Party having a go at the NHS in Scotland, giving the appalling state of the NHS in Wales, we all know that all NHS services, in fact all countries' health services, have had to deal with the pandemic. But in Scotland, the NHS is the best performing health service in the UK, and that includes the badly performing NHS in Wales.
All right.
So Labour are no answer to the interests of the people of Scotland.
Let me just come back to Simon. What's your response to the constitutional point, firstly?
Well, the reality is that the threshold for a second referendum within a decade on tearing apart our country needs to be higher than the governing party of Scotland.
But you said no, even when it was higher and has been higher.
Well, we had a referendum in 2014, literally 10 years ago next autumn, which is the maximum extent of this Parliament. We had a referendum on that question, and we settled this question.
Continually won majorities, big majorities.
And that support is now imploding, and we're going to see that, I'm afraid, next year. And that is why this strategy is being dreamt up, because they know they will not obtain the support of a majority of Scots. They won't come close to doing so. They'll probably get about a third of the Scottish electorate. That is not a mandate for a second referendum.
Munira?
Well, I think this argument is absurd, as you pointed out, Joe, that SNP think that they could lose seats at the next general election and that gives them a mandate to negotiate another independence referendum. I think when I talk to my Scottish colleagues, when they're out knocking on doors, they say this is not the priority for voters. It is a total distraction, this constant focus on independence, when actually what most Scottish voters want is a focus on the cost of living, crisis in our NHS, sewage in our rivers and seas, and schools that should be performing better and are crumbling. that is what most Scottish people want to see their government focus on, not this constant focus on independence.
Can I just show everybody, including, I know, Keith, you can't see it, but I'll read you the headline. The Scottish Daily Mail, it says, Sturgeon steals the limelight. You will have seen Nicola Sturgeon in the headlines. Humza overshadowed as ex-First Minister wows SNP conference, but at least she backs him for ripping up her independence plan. Do you think she did steal the limelight, Camilla?
Well, almost by design, but I think that's because there isn't the confidence in Yousaf that there was in her. And I think you did point to the fact that she did have good leadership qualities, that she did have a huge amount of charisma, and that she was the kind of figurehead for the independence movement. And I think, actually, you know, it's unfortunate, isn't it? This nickname, you know, Humza Useless, has kind of taken hold. I think that support for the SNP is imploding. I agree with Munira that I don't think it's a priority for the Scottish people. Also, you know, a lifetime isn't 10 years, is it? A lifetime isn't a decade. I think if you give a once-in-a-lifetime referendum, most people think that's, what, half a century at a bare minimum?
Well, we can negotiate that, I suppose, another point. But, Keith, on Nicola Sturgeon stealing the limelight, I mean, it's a sticky wicket, isn't it, for Humza Yousaf?
No, I think, especially given the last weeks with what's happened in the Middle East, Humza Yousaf is really starting to get a profile which is necessary to be leader of the SNP in terms of the way he's led international opinion on his response, of course informed by his own personal family circumstances. And of course, if you think back to when Nicola Sturgeon first became leader of the SNP's First Minister, of course you've got to move beyond the influence of your predecessor. But Nicola Sturgeon was an outstanding politician, outstanding leader of the SNP. Just to say, I'm glad that we've got unanimity amongst all the UK parties that are there. None of them have mentioned the point that you've mentioned. 50% at least of people in Scotland support independence. And the reason they won't refer to that is because that's the real basis of Scotland's demand for independence. People want it. And the idea that the SNP, I've heard you all say it, the SNP support is imploding. After 16 years, we still lead the polls for Westminster and for the Scottish parliamentary elections.
I'm glad you brought that.
The most trusted party in Scotland.
Well, as you've raised that, conveniently, we have a graph to show precisely your point, Keith. You can see in the Scottish Parliament election polls we're talking about, you can see in a year the SNP support has dropped 10% from 47 to 37%. But Keith is absolutely right. They are ahead, the SNP, of the other major parties. Labour has increased a bit. The Conservatives and Liberal Democrats have flatlined. I mean, if you can't capitalise, Simon, on the basis of all of the woes that we have listed for the SNP, you know, you're not striking a chord with Scottish voters at all, are you?
Well, the reality is, of course, that support for unionism in Scotland is split three ways, and that is what these polls fail to reflect. The unionist cause in Scotland is strong. I think
you flatlined in a year.
I think the reality is that the Scottish Conservative Party has performed pretty resiliently, and the defection of Lisa Cameron to us just last week, citing the toxicity of the political culture of the SNP, reflects, I think, the exhaustion that Scotland feels with this party hell-bent on division, obsessed with it to the exclusion of all the other social and economic issues facing Scotland. It is not healthy. There is no mandate for it. It is not going to happen.
I mean, Alex, are you expecting to win the next Scottish parliamentary elections?
We are going to fight every single seat.
Now, are you expecting to win?
We are offering people of Scotland the change that they want. I mean, I'm not going to predict what we're going to do.
Why aren't you ambitious enough to say, we'll beat the SNP, we'll go first?
We just beat them in Rutherglen and Hamilton West.
Yes.
We won that seat back.
Yes.
You know, that shows that the people of Scotland are crying out for change. They are being failed by two governments at the moment, and I think that was very much apparent when I was knocking doors, talking to voters up there in Scotland about what they want to see and what they want changed. It is time for change, and I think only a Labour Party can beat the Conservatives up there and the SNP, as we've just shown, in order to deliver it.
Why only 6% for the Liberal Democrats, despite all of the massive problems the party has been going through? The SNP, that is, not the Liberal Democrats.
Well, if we actually look at election results rather than polls, at the last local elections of all the opposition parties, the Liberal Democrats gained the most seats at council elections. And so when Scottish voters see Liberal Democrats actually doing great things in their local communities, they are going out and voting for us.
Keith, final word ahead of our special programme later on this afternoon covering Humza Yousaf's speech. Keith? Oh, have we
Sorry,
lost?
sorry, I didn't
yes,
catch that.
it is. Keith, it was to you to have a final word before we let you go, and I was just trailing our special programme this afternoon to cover Humza Yousaf's speech.
Well, very much looking forward to it. Of course, he'll mention the strategy which we agreed yesterday in a tremendous debate, the likes of which you will not see in other parties. And just to reiterate the point, he will deliver that speech against the backdrop of the SNP still being the most popular party in Scotland. In relation to the Liberal Democrats, who I think have 4 MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, it was the SNP that won more seats than anybody else at the local elections just a couple of years ago. And if Labour can't even put their ambitions to win the election, just to remind you, talking about polls, in 2011, 2 months before the election in 2011, Labour were 15 points ahead in the polls. The SNP broke the system and won 69 out of 129 seats. And I think the reason for that, I genuinely believe the reason for that, is that the only party that will always speak up just for Scotland is not the Labour Party, who will be told what to do by Keir Starmer, and not the Tory Party. And that's why I'm confident of continued electoral success from the SNP. And I think that's what we'll hear from the First Minister this afternoon.
Keith Brown, Deputy Leader of the SNP, thank you very much for joining us.